Okay, well, welcome everybody to another conversation on the future of work. Um, Before we start, I just wanted to quickly acknowledge the National Science Foundation for partially funding this effort, and it's a recorded event. Thank you. And if you have questions, then please put them in the chat, and or it will be moderating. So today we're very happy to welcome MC Schraefel. MC holds a professorship in computer science and human performance at the University of Southampton. I'm probably mispronouncing that.
No, it's good. No, Southampton, you got it. You got it just right.
And then she leads the Wealth Lab there. And I find it really interesting that she's also a certified strength and conditioning specialist.
That's right.
Functional neurologist and nutritionist.
Yep.
So, welcome. Very nice to have you, MC.
It's a pleasure.
I wanted to start with the embodied perspective. So
sure.
This conversation, the title has this term embodied perspective, and I wanted to start by exploring this particular term. So let me first ask, what is the problem that led you to introduce this idea of the embodied perspective?
That we're sick and HCI hasn't solved it. And by sick, what I mean is that the national averages in most of the countries that might be joining us right now have gone statistically into conditions that will promote disease if they're not already diseased. So overweight to obesity, stress, underslept, all of these are way above 69% in the UK anyway. And the last time I looked at the US stats, it was similar. So those are all tending towards a normal statistical and a cultural normal that is not healthful. And as far as I can tell, as much as I love our discipline, we haven't helped really make the population better. Even though there's an abundance now of fitness trackers that affluent folks can afford, it doesn't mean they're being used or people are staying using them. And so that led me to kind of ask a question, especially with the background around the sports science side, to be able to say, are our tools aligned with what we know about how we work on the inside to support us, to support what we do, how we work? And the answer is no. And so that is like, okay, if we're not aligned with how we know we work on the inside, our embodied cells, maybe we need to surface up what those processes are and start to see how we can align the design with how we actually function.
And so is that then, in a nutshell, the embodied perspective?
The embodied perspective then, that's a nice follow-on question. I really appreciate that. The idea then with embodied is not just to crack open an anatomy textbook, because that would, that's a lot of work, but has been for people like myself to do some of that heavy lifting, to come up with some models to say, okay, if you're not going to go to med school or do sports science or something deep like that, how can you start to think about aligning the design with these processes? And so embodied interaction has a suite of models that say, here's some ways to think about design. And we can come back to what some of those are if you'd like. But that's kind of the approach, is to say, here are some models that we test that we know. For instance, I'll just give you one. There's a quick one that says there's 5 semi-volitional processes that we can interact with non-invasively. And they're going to be familiar to you. It's move, eat, engage, cogitate, like learn new stuff, and sleep. Those are the only 5 things we can really engage with that have been shown to affect life. Like, you don't eat for a while, you're dead. So that's pretty simple proof there. Understanding how those interact and how we can, the other model in embodied interaction is called tuning, is that how we can help somebody feel interoceptively how to get the knowledge, skills, and practice to be able to use those. That's the design challenge, is how do you help people build those skills so that they can start to really take care of themselves healthfully. And then the bigger challenge from that on the group and infrastructure level is, how do we make it so that you're not alone having to push a rock up a health hill to try to maintain that state, that the infrastructure and the working tools facilitate that so that it's as effortless as going into an office right now is to see a chair and a computer screen and you sit down and you blow your eyes out.
Got it. You had a recent special issue in Interactions magazine,
Yeah.
and on embodied design. So could you tell us what are some of the things that you've learned from the people who submitted, the people who published in this?
That it's really fun to see people interpret how to use these paradigms to help align the design. So Elizabeth Murnane, who's now at Dartmouth, put in an article around really using part of what we call the circumbodied model, the stuff around us that affects every cell in our body, like light, and to use that proactively to assist with this kind of what you might call passive interaction, where you create the state that effortlessly affects your well-being. You don't have to think about it. The system is helping you do that. That was fantastic. We got another one on smell by Tom Gaylor at Lancaster, talking about how, can we leverage the fact that there's a nerve going right from our smell sense right straight into our brain. It doesn't get mediated through the midbrain like every other cranial nerve. How might we use that for how we learn stuff and sleep together? So that's kind of cool. So once people start to get the sense that, okay, we're going to really look at these internal processes and ask the question, how do they work? And then how can we use how they work for us to feel better is kind of cool.
Very
and
nice.
I really like this passive interaction stuff too, where you're just saying, what can we do about the environment so that it is effortless to interact with a healthful environment?
I really like your example of the chair and the computer. I haven't thought of it that way, but that truly is one of those things that is natural, and I do it. And that's a brilliant way to point out how we don't do that necessarily for our health.
No, I mean, this is, I think for some of you might have heard me talk about this before, but I do think it's worth repeating, is that if somebody said to you, here is this beautiful little computational device that has this gorgeous screen on it, look at the high resolution, you can have it now, but in 5 years, you will give me your eyes. It's like,
Right.
Are you crazy? But
Right.
seriously, we have literally been giving our vision quality to these devices because we haven't thought, you know what? Being in focus all the time, that's actually causing tension in the ciliary muscles that never lets go. We need stuff that's at least 7 feet away from us to relax our vision. So it's not very good. How that's a big design challenge. How do we reimagine for the future of work and our well-being, how to design these devices that let us do this reading thing in a way that's not going to kill our eyes? What is the cost now of going totally VR, where you've got a screen even this close to your eyes?
I love the fact that you mentioned well-being, because that's my next
Okay.
question. So, this term is definitely something that our HCIs looked at, and I think it's accelerated. At least that's my impression with the pandemic.
Yep.
But it's a pretty broad term. So I would like to ask you, what does well-being mean to you? And I can tell you that we certainly, I don't know if we struggled, but it's certainly in our research, we think of well-being, but then we sort of started thinking, well, maybe we need to really focus on pieces of that. So how do you define well-being? What is well-being for you?
Well-being is a pain in the ass. I mean, as a term, it totally sucks. Like in the UK, where I am right now, there is a kind of clear use of that it usually refers to mental health, and health refers to everything else that's neck down. And that is a kind of bifurcation that I've seen repeatedly, which is why we called it the Wealth Lab, to bring well-being and health together. Like, this is not, we need a new term, because health has great definitions by the WHO, and in 2012 they revised this. They said health is a process. It's a process not just of being sick, but it's how we maintain physical, social, and emotional well-being or healthfulness, not a state of disease. And so that sense of process is really important. But I guess, to offer something back, it's, yes, take the bits that are important. And for me, one of the bits that's important is to say, we are holistic beings. Everything we do is mediated through the body. So again, in the UK context, if you're talking about well-being and you usually mean mental health, quit taking the body out of it. everything is affected by the state of the body, including whether we're depressed or happy. The link between the gut and the brain through the cranial nerve 10 is getting so well established in terms of how the microbiome affects that relationship. It's like, if you're depressed, how's your diet? How are you sleeping? You know, that's what the N5 is about. What are these synergies? So I agree with you. It's really difficult to try to figure out these things. And the other thing that's really upsetting about when you talk about health is that people tend to think about not disease. So they think of it in this medical preventative term. Coming from sort of the sports side, it's like the body's about performance. But when you say performance to HCI, people, it's like, I'm not talking about efficiency. So we need a new term, Smedley or something. We want to have the Smedley track. Can we just redefine it? Yeah, I feel your pain. Haha.
Good. I'm glad we're not alone.
Oh no, you're not alone.
The other thing I wanted to ask you is, one suggested way of improving this well-being is mindfulness. And at CHI 2019, you published a review paper that explores this idea. So what are some of the main points that we as HCI researchers should know about mindfulness?
That's a beautiful question. I can think of about maybe three things. That one is mindfulness is sort of one of the attributes of meditation. And it's actually worth looking at some of the research, the deeper research now from psychology and medicine, actually. I hate to say it, but they have the MRI machine. So they've been doing some really interesting work on looking at different types of meditation. And I'm really fascinated lately by especially the stuff where it focuses on love, and it's called loving kindness or compassion. You just search for that and you'll see incredible things that are happening in the brain. So that gets to sort of the next point, why bother with this? One of my interests, again, from the more physical sports performance side with mindfulness is actually around the question that we can ask in HCI. You're asking, what was their takeaways for HCI? And I would suggest the question is, what do you want to achieve? What do you think you want to achieve by getting into mindfulness? Because that's become such a buzzword. And if you think about what you want to achieve, then you can ask, is this what's going to solve that problem? And again, from the N5 perspective, where sort of there's cogitate, which would put the mindfulness and meditation in, and there's physical exercise. If you again look at the research on how this works internally, you'll see that exercise does an awful lot of the same things that mindfulness does, and that even other forms of meditation do. So the question might be, what are you looking for that might be unique to meditation in terms of neuroplasticity or areas of the brain you want to help, or types of sleep you might want to disrupt, because actually this can get quite disruptive. There's several studies now that show this. So my biggie is, what's the question you hope mindfulness will help you address? Use it deliberately and look for what else does the same thing. Because if something else does the same thing and somebody goes, I'm not doing that mindfulness stuff, maybe you can solve the problem in another way. So those are some of the heuristics from the mindfulness side.
Got it. So I know that there are questions coming up.
Okay,
and
great.
Before I turn it over to Ort, I wanted to ask one more question,
sure.
which is that we are in a pandemic.
Oh, yes.
And we're in this COVID-19 situation. So can you tell us your work, how does it translate, or how did you attempt to make what you're already working on, relevant in this situation?
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple of folks online, I think Seb Middleu and George Murison and Richard Gomer. These are folks who've, George and Seb are current PhD students. Richard has been a PhD student before. And some of the ways we're looking at this is like work with Richard and George has been about, in particular, around helping people find ways to explore what does it feel like to get movement in or daylight in during the week, so that you can start to value that practice. So self-experimentation, guided self-experimentation is one part. One thing, though, that we're really excited about that Seb and George and I have been working on with Josh Andres at IBM and with Sean Rental in Microsoft is around how to better bring the physiology of what's missing when we're doing this online stuff. We are wired to connect together. And when we go online like this, a lot of that neural interaction is not there. So we're looking at ways that you can help simulate some of those factors so that we can actually engage better. And we put something into a conference called CSCW, so we're waiting for reviews, so we can't talk about it too much, about the mechanisms that we're talking about, meta meetings. What happens around, before, after the meeting that we can support with these embodied processes that we can show can have a cognitive benefit. Because as you pointed out, this is kind of part of our normal now. So making it better, we're finding, is not about better audio, better video alone. It's also about how do we make this more human in terms of that group interaction. I think it's absolutely fantastic to be able to say, we are actually wired neurologically to work together. Wow. Like our facial expressions, the only reason we have them is to communicate to somebody else how you're feeling. So that's kind of an important question too. How do you feel? So I'll leave that there. And I know that Seven, George, and Richard would be delighted to hear from folks who might be interested in this.
Wonderful. Well,
we're not too bad for time either. We're doing okay.
We're doing fantastically, yeah. All right, maybe you want to take over and take some questions?
Yes, thank you, Amsa. This is fascinating, and I think
we having fun?
We're having fun, and looking at the questions, we're about to go even deeper into bigger questions.
Hit me.
So we have excellent questions. I'm going to ask Diana first to kind of go and ask her question. And just before Diana is kind of jumping in, it would be great if the folks that are working with you can turn on the cameras and they can kind of jump into the conversation as well.
Yeah. And be happy to post some links too, guys, by all means.
Hi, so I had kind of a philosophical question, I guess. How can we tackle these health issues with technology while avoiding falling into ableist, fatphobic tropes, or worsening the stigma around mental illness? And I know we as designers are not immune to these kind of thoughts, and they can kind of seep into the design process. So what can we do as designers to avoid this?
That's an awesome question. And as I said at my PhD defense, when somebody said, I have a question, I said, can you answer this? I said, I can answer anything as long as I'm not constrained by accuracy. So this time, in respect for your question, I would like to offer just, here's an insight, here's something to think about, because I don't have the answer. But what I have found in working in these kinds of spaces is not to be afraid of them, and to focus on co-design, to bring your knowledge and expertise with humility to a group, to be able to understand what's important to you, how do you feel, how would you like to feel better, and then figure out again what's important there. We talk about in embodied interaction, we have this continuum, which talk about from insourcing to outsourcing. A lot of health stuff right now is what we might call outsourcing. You know, you got your special watch on that tells you how many steps to take and how your heart rate is. And that's okay for some of the time, but you might want to think about designing so that people can start to insource that experience so that they can feel it for themselves. And what we find is that folks don't necessarily know what feeling better is like. So are you willing to do the listening about where, and this is part of coaching from the sports performance side too, is that if you want to make your athlete better, you know what that athlete needs to do, right? You got the program. But if they don't hear that, if they're not in that same place, it's really important to be willing to work with where they're coming from rather than to have your solutions. And one final heuristic, if I may offer, if that's okay? Yeah, is always think to yourself, where are batteries really required? Like, where are they going to make a lasting difference and for how long? So put time into it. So again, with people looking, there's a whole culture around sedentary behavior. I saw they had a website up, and it's like, okay, if you don't want people to sit anymore, burn the frickin' chairs. You don't need technology to solve that. You don't need little apps. It's a fundamental cultural shift. So if I can help you, if you're doing a job like that and you know you want to talk about working with things, I'm happy to engage, love to chat, because, you know, working with groups and learning to listen can be really humbling and extremely rewarding. And then they do your work. They tell you, you know, so helping people learn how to design for themselves is really empowering. They won't always, this is why bring your knowledge. Like if I get to bring my expertise about eating and making things easier for them than they thought was possible to have a positive effect, fantastic. But it's like, I'm not going to tell them what to do anymore. I used to be very good at that. As you can probably tell, I can do that. But it doesn't work. So I'd rather it work. But group design stuff, we need more work on how to work with groups. Peter Block, if you want to read his community-based design stuff, Peter Block's stuff is awesome. I recommend it to you. Come back to me someday. Let me know how it's going, okay? Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
No, it's such an
Thank you.
important question. It's such an important question. How do we help anybody that's feeling distress? And we all want to feel better. We all want to feel better.
And kind of going from this point and expanding, I think Peter is taking us further.
Sure. So this is, I think, another difficult question that neither you nor I have the answer to, but I'm interested to hear your perspective.
Thank you.
You started off talking about things like stress and lack of sleep, right?
Mm-hmm.
And from my perspective, those things are rooted inherently to some degree in capitalism, right? Capitalism makes us in competition with each other, disposable, right?
Yep.
Unless we have a huge amount of money. So
I don't.
I want to be wary of this idea, right, that we can solve the problems of society with some sort of technological veneer when they're really like deeply rooted, right? No matter
Yep.
what new thing we invent, we'll probably always be stressful and have lack of sleep unless we can get to more lower level causes. So my dramatic phrasing of this question is, do you think that better interfaces for our work are going to solve all our problems, or do you think that work itself is part of the problem?
I don't think work is part of the problem, and I don't believe that HCI designing another little nudge to go stand up every hour is going to solve it. I really think that the question that Andrew is asking with the future of work and his special issue coming up soon on the future of work is trying to get at is, let's allow ourselves the freedom to imagine the future of work that is not constrained by everything we know is making us sick. We don't need any more research to know that sedentarism is making us sick. We don't need any more research to know that shit jobs, having to work 2 of them in a row so you don't have time to spend with your family, is keeping the poor people unhealthy. We don't need more research to show that 80% of the workforce is feeling stressed out at work. We know these things. What is keeping us from saying, okay, what do we have to do to start over? And technology, I guarantee you, can be part of this in terms of a time-limited thing. I mean, the bias for me in embodied interaction is this is where we can use some tools to help people go from the outsourcing of skills to the insourcing of knowledge, and to figure out, like I've said this before, we outsource buying our groceries. That's great because I don't have the land to grow my own. And maybe that's something to think about. But again, that's I would say, potentially legitimate outsourcing, think locally, ethically, et cetera, maybe move more food stuff home. But again, if we can help people learn how good a walk feels in the morning, to get some sunlight versus being inside on a treadmill, even if you have one, all that kind of stuff, that's great. But we need to think bigger. HCI has an obligation to think about interacting with infrastructure. Burn the frickin' chairs, burn the chairs, burn the chairs. And then what? You know, what replaces these screens that we're now, I'm killing my eyes by talking to you. You're killing your eyes worse because you've got glasses on already. Looking at me, doing this, we're hurting ourselves. My God, I call it the vitamin approach to well-being. It's like these little steps that we take. Vitamins are designed to help us survive today. They cost you by not thinking about how you're going to feel 10 years from now. We have to start designing for us to thrive longer. So no, capitalism sucks. I don't know what to do about that, but I do know that HCI has to lift its eyes off the individual. God, human-computer interaction doesn't mean just individuals. Let's imagine the future of work for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's an awesome answer. Can I just follow up real quickly?
Of course.
To me, I mean, I'm asking this question in this forum where I have asked many questions before and feel fairly comfortable, right? And I think one tension for me in asking this kind of question in other forums is there's a political nature to it, right?
Just go for it, Peter.
And so sometimes you have, or at least I feel, a tension between, you know, should I stick to my role as scientist, objective, which we know isn't really totally the case, right? Or is it okay to be political? How have you navigated that tension in, you know, giving this presentation to other groups or other things like that?
I will go and talk wherever I am asked to go and talk, and so far nobody's thrown anything at me. And being, you know, at this side of the screen, I feel fairly safe that I will not be impacted, at least in that way. You follow your heart. You talk to people whom you trust, and you try to stay as safe as you are morally able to be. And again, all I can suggest is, wait 5 minutes if you want to say something, which is advice I don't always follow, but probably I'm learning to just, you know, breathe, awareness, mindfulness, awareness. Oh, look at me, I'm having a response. And probably, if it's still meaningful, like justice is a really important issue. Equity is a really important issue. Then what can we do, and how can what our expertise is facilitate that? It's just go with your heart and don't be stupid.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to, like you mentioned, how we think together collectively on the future of work. And one topic that we're considering when we think about the future of work is automation. And
Yes.
how we're going to interact with automation. Now, the popular media like to think about automation as going to take away our jobs, but research indicates that it's more likely that we will live in workplaces where we work together with some sort of automation rather than completely replaced by automation. And I'd love to hear your view about what does it mean for the future of work? What does it mean for the future of well-being? What does it mean from the embodied perspective?
Well, we have bodies, and I think here's another continuum in embodied interaction, which is raw to cyborg, which asks us, it doesn't value judge one end or the other. It just says, let's start thinking proactively about where does this sit? Are we designing to become more outsourced and more cyborgy, or do we want to design to feel more introspectively and be more raw? And what are the advantages and trade-offs about that? So just to ask the question, I think, is really important. And again, could go back to Andrew's about the mindfulness thing. It's like, what problem are we trying to solve? Like, if we're trying to have all this automation so that we can just consume more stuff and take up more resources and reinforce wage slavery, then we might not want to do that. And again, I think HCI is in a really great place as designers to pull back and to ask, okay, not what this thing is, but what's the context in which this thing might flourish, and what are the side effects of that? I think we have the opportunity as designers, as engineers, to ask those contextual questions. And if it turns out that this is going to be a huge benefit to everybody, and it's not just the people who are putting money into it who are saying that, but the people who it will affect are saying, actually, I don't want to clean toilets anymore. I'd far rather have a job that has more meaning and worth, and or be able to survive by working fewer hours. Fantastic, get that little robo thing in here. But so that's sort of it. It's like, who are we asking these questions to?
Thank you, MC. This was
It's a
such
pleasure,
a wonderful,
Andrew. Thank you.
This is a brilliant conversation. Really
Burn the
invigorating.
chair.
Burn the chair.
Burn the chair.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I'd like to wrap up this recorded part of the conversation in a minute. Just before I do, Michael Muller will be with us next week.
Awesome.
Talk about human intervention to make data science good.
Yep.
And please stick around for a more informal conversation. So I'll stop the recording now.
Okay. I don't know how it can get more informal, but let's
Well,
find
we
out.
try.